Russia used energy as an economic weapon against Ukraine in 2007, but it seems that it has now fully played the gas and oil cards, and Russia is losing the energy war. Has Vladimir Putin's winter gas attack backfired as Moscow has been frozen out of the lucrative European energy markets? Or will the terroristic threats against nuclear facilities re-emerge if Russia starts to lose badly on the battlefield? Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce, and it will help us to introduce the amazing speakers to a new audience. Anastasiya Shapochkina is founder and president of Eastern Circles. She has 11 years experience in consulting and energy industry, where she worked on companies, technologies, and market analysis in the renewable energy, utilities, nuclear energy, and e-mobility sectors. She led development of international cross-industry partnership research projects on these subjects and represented business in European industrial and research associations. Anastasiya is a lecturer on geopolitics in Sciences Po in Paris since 2012, focusing on the role of business in the EU-Russia relations. Anastasiya is author of articles on the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the former Soviet Union. She has regular TV and radio appearances. She also graduated from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, German and European Studies program. And I should point out, Anastasiya, it's a huge privilege to actually welcome you back for a second time to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's jump into our key topic today. Today, we're going to talk about energy sanctions. We're going to talk about the European energy situation, China-Russia relations, and then we're going to end on nuclear sanctions. And I know that these are all questions which are perhaps not covered in enough detail in the mainstream media. And last time we spoke about them, our audience responded incredibly positively to your expert knowledge and detail. Well, let's start. How is Russia adapting to the energy sanctions regime?
So first we have to say, I would like to say a few words about the sanctions themselves. Coal was, we're talking, when we're talking about energy and Europe-Russia relations, then we're talking, of course, about, we're thinking all about natural gas, but of course there is also oil, there is also coal, there are also refined products, and there are also, there's also electricity. So let's focus on the most important topics for the Russian budget and for the Russian cash flows. It's oil trade first and foremost, and then gas trade. To deal quickly with this is, of course, let's remind ourselves a few numbers. So, in the beginning of the year, last year, Europe was dependent for about 40% of its imports from Russia of natural gas. About 1/3 of its imports of coal it depended on Russia, and about 1/4 of its imports of oil it also depended on Russia. And also the EU imported about half of Russian exports, so a bit different, right, of refined petroleum products. And just to say that once the war started, therefore, having these numbers in mind was important for analysts to make all sorts of predictions about how the European reaction toward Russian geopolitical behavior may evolve. Because, of course, we have all heard about Russia using energy as a leverage. What it means specifically, concretely, we've seen since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and that meant that everybody just was freezing in their decision-making process, trying to digest how they could now transition the European states, especially, from dealing with Russia as a business partner, to dealing with Russia as a military threat, and potentially also a nuclear threat. And that brings to my mind that, of course, I'm forgetting a very important aspect of this energy relationship between Russia and Europe, but also between Russia and the larger world. It is nuclear energy, and we, of course, are going to talk about that as well. And the most optimistic was considered to be even so optimistic that it was considered unrealistic prognosis was immediately offered by the European Commission, which reacted in a short and then longer vision of how it planned to deal with this problem of kind of weaning itself of dependency on Russian energy really quickly in order to allow itself more maneuver for its own geopolitical decisions. Because of course, when we're talking about leverage, it means that any political decision which can be against Russia, people who are taking it, they're going to think 3 times before taking it because their gas may be turned off. And that is how it used to be working in the past many times in relationship between Russia and other countries, not just in the European Union. And it worked. And Russia was assuming all of this time through these past experiences that it was going to work in the future as well. And that it was going to continue to blackmail the European Union states, even in the situation. The reasons for this were very simple. The past experience of Russia invading Georgia, which resulted in, for example, things like freezing NATO-Russia Council, work for only 6 months and then unfreezing it and restoring it, annexing the Crimea, which didn't result in any interruption of business cooperation between the European Union, with the exception of several sanctions that we have seen implemented, but not at all affecting the cash flows from gas and oil trade, most important. And then the invasion of Russia, of the east of Ukraine, and since 2014 as well. So all of these lessons by Russia, they gave them this kind of ground to think that this relationship through energy is so important for European economies. We are talking, of course, not just about heating in your home, but we're talking about dependency on important industry, European industry, on stable, predictable flows of energy, be it electricity, be it heat, be it whatever the industry needs to function. And thus, this supplies of gas became really important issue, not just for a regular person at home, but for German industry, Italian industry, etc. And so this assumption, immediately the European Union answered, the Commission answered in March, issuing Repower EU, first summary of its Repower EU vision, a document which was called like this, which said pretty much that by the end of 2022, the Commission thought it was possible to reduce the imports of Russian natural gas by 75%. The immediate reaction of all energy analysts to this was that it was absolutely impossible, and the Commission was just dreaming. And the International Energy Agency, in its most optimistic scenarios, predicted that this percentage, this share of reduction of energy imports could reach maybe 50%, but not 75%. The most optimistic. And the reasons for that were, of course, numerous. First, that the supplies between Russia and Europe are happening by pipeline, through which you can transport the biggest volumes of natural gas. Everything else between all European Union and all other countries, it's not pipeline. It would be either it's a pipeline from Algeria, but then you have very limited supplies, or you can increase supplies via liquefied natural gas imports, and that presumes both that there is more liquefied natural gas production in exporting countries and that there is a capacity to import liquefied natural gas through the adapted infrastructure in the importing countries. This was not the case in the European Union. The situation was, for example, the biggest consumer of natural gas, of Russian natural gas, was Germany in the beginning of 2022. 65% of German natural gas consumption came from Russia. 65% of German natural gas imports came from Russia. Almost all of it is imported. So, and to reduce that, and of course, the most important reliant on this gas was German industry, which is the most important industry in the European Union. So the strategic implications of this dependence on gas dependence were enormous. And Germany happened to be the country in the beginning of the year with no capacity, with no infrastructure capacity at all to liquefy, to regasify natural gas it would receive through the boards. So therefore, all of this prognosis was based on reality of the beginning of 2022. However, the Commission's optimism was based on one, I think, very important premise of it, which everybody kind of forgot. The premise of real survival, physical survival, economical as well. And once the European Union the war progressed and everybody realized, unlike in the beginning, There were people thought the war was going to be over in 3 days, in 3 weeks, in 1 month. People were counting days, and then only a few people realized from the very start, because they've been following this for a long time and they know how wars go, that this is going to take many years. And this is how wars now, unlike World War II, World War I, with which parallels are drawn often, the wars now don't tend to end. And thus, within these months of very important and huge and high intensity conflict, people realized that not just the energy security, but also the survival, the security very much simply was at stake. And that triggered action and results, which were absolutely seemed unattainable last March. In particular, German dependency today on Russian gas import is zero. They managed to substitute 65% of their imports coming from one source, Russian Federation, with the imports coming now primarily from the US and Norway. And then, of course, there are other sources. The US, albeit we hear and we read about the struggle President Biden is having on putting pressure on the industry to produce more. The US is and will be producing more because, of course, if there is demand, these are 101 economics lessons, right? There's going to be supply. And Germany being able to replace Russian gas, of course, other countries, we're seeing the same dynamics. And hence, the level of European Commission's target, the Ursula von der Leyen was able to announce, was reached already in the end of October. By the end of October, Commission proudly announced that the European Union had been able to rid itself of 2/3 of Russian gas imports, which seemed absolutely unattainable in March. Now, second, we are going now to, as a result of this, just to kind of on the other side of the book, we see, of course, several important dynamics are setting themselves up. First of all, Russia does not have immediately the means to redirect its natural gas exports to other countries. So when we hear about Russia pivoting to Asia and redirecting its energy exports to Asia, we have to keep in mind, primarily we're talking about oil. Oil is possible to redirect, gas is less possible to redirect. Again, the biggest obstacle primarily is the availability of the appropriate infrastructure. Today, Russia can export by a pipeline to China up to 38 billion cubic meters of gas a year. This is the capacity of the Power of Siberia pipeline, the gas pipeline. This is uncomparable and is much lower than the market that Russia has lost. Most of it Russia has lost, which was the exports of natural gas to Europe, which amounted to between 160 and 200 billion cubic meters a year, depending on demand and the more or less hot or cold year. This, of course, means that the remaining capacity, which is not being exported, part of the Russian exports to Europe continue. As we said, Europe read itself of 2/3 of Russian of imports from Russia, but not of 100%. But this is uncomparably lower than what we have seen, right, in the past. And to replace that with China or with any other country is very difficult because of the infrastructure absence. Russia has announced plans to build new pipelines or to increase capacity or to build a second, but these are plans. And the plans are, to be precise, the ambition for capacity exports increase to China is to increase the gas exports to 48 billion cubic meters from today maximum capacity 38, not necessarily filled, by 2025, and to 88 billion cubic meters by 2030. This also places us in perspective, right? Because also the numbers are uncomparable with 160 billion cubic meters to the European Union exports. So when we're talking about China replacing the European Union for Russian energy exports, we have to put it in perspective.
And that project, I mean, the question on that one is Nord Stream. I mean, the Nord Stream projects are not just months, but years or even decades long projects in the planning and the build. So this is like turning around a super tanker, isn't it? It's not something you can do at the drop of a hat. And what I wanted to ask, at the beginning of the crisis, as you say, people were looking day by day, not expecting, one, the war to last, unless, you speak to certain generals or experts on Russian military history, and then they could tell you, yeah, of course, this is going to go on and on. But the other thing, I guess, amongst especially, in Europe, but probably other countries as well, is the normalization or the tendency to try and normalize the situation, and to also look at Russia's actions, but use your own kind of logical framework. So Russia spent 2 decades building energy infrastructure to make its entire economy dependent on supplying the regular supply of energy to a single market, which is Europe. And the normalization mindset would be, well, a country would not cut off its nose to spite its face. It would not destroy its entire economic logic. Obviously, Brexit tells us that can happen. But you wouldn't take your entire business model that you've geared your country towards and then just chuck it into the bin. With far more catastrophic consequences than perhaps even Brexit had. And yet that's exactly what Russia's done.
Yes, and of course, nobody could have ever imagined in their worst dreams that Russia was going to what today is suspected to be sabotage its own pipelines, including Nord Stream. But I think that to explain this, I think there is reality, which is what you described, but also there is then the anticipation or strategic planning or whatever planning that took place in the heads of the Russian leadership before the full invasion. And I think that there was not an expectation that this was going to happen. Just in the same way that nobody believed the European Commission in March last year, the same way, I don't think that the Russian leadership had ever anticipated that the European Union and the US are going to unite, are going to supply weapons to Ukraine in such massive amounts eventually that would allow Ukraine to last on the front lines up until this point. It is not enough, but it is much more than the Russians have ever anticipated. And I don't think they have anticipated the united front of the West at all. In general, they have there was assumption about long-term friends and allies in the European Union, not just Hungary, but also, for example, Bulgaria, which had happened to be entirely an unreliable friend for Russia. And then there were Putin, just in his latest New Year address, he had again talked 31st of December 2022. He talked again about he said again that we have friends in the European Union and in the United States. There is this belief that the elites in the West are extraordinarily corrupt. And we have numerous examples, from Gerhard Schröder to François Fillon to the former Foreign Affairs Ministry of Austria, etc., etc. But this belief drove Putin to anticipate that the reaction to this invasion is going to be similar to the Western reaction to other invasions we had just mentioned. And the fact that the reaction was totally different and that all of a sudden the West felt threatened itself, and NATO felt threatened and went fully into the rearming logic as well. I think this came as a surprise. And so the original calculation might have been not that all of this was going to just disappear, but that the West is going to eat up the invasion and that the relationship in business in the energy sector were going to continue as usual. And the second assumption, in my opinion, that took place, and again, we have no idea what's happening in the minds of the Kremlin, but from what the Russian analysts are saying and what we can guess, right, as a guesswork, right? The second assumption was that the war was going to be very quick and very victorious. So hence the Russian plans has the Russian name for the war as the special military operation, and the vision first that the war was going to end in a few weeks, that Kyiv was going to be taken, there was going to be a puppet government installed, and game over. And the second vision, once that didn't work out, and that was all over the Russian news and analysis, etc., and just propaganda news as well as the other news, the anticipation inside the Kremlin by the summer was that once the winter starts, in Europe. By October, it was going to be so hard to live without Russian gas that Europeans were going to cancel all the sanctions. And this was a real kind of thought and discussion subject in the Russian media and analytical circles. And of course, this is something that by October, something absolutely unimaginable from the European side, when, of course, here by October, we're really talking big time militarization, and there is no talk anymore. Nobody would be allowed to go back to the same. So this is, for me, what can explain the unexplainable, right? It's just this dissonance between reality and the preferred vision of reality.
Well, I called a friend. I mean, just with the personal perspective there, I called a friend they live in between Moscow and St. Petersburg, and we called up to see how they were getting on, and they were far more worried about us. They were like, "You're freezing to death. Do you have enough food to eat?" They didn't ask it, but they wanted to ask, have you turned to dog food yet? And it's like, yeah, no, that's not a thing.
The video, there was a video which went very big in Russia, which was made a propaganda video, which showed different parts of Russia, because different parts of a country absolutely covered in snow and ice, which, if you've ever been to Europe, to which actually more than 70% of Russians have never been and will never be. If you've ever been to Europe, this is not how Europe looks like in the winter at all. There are places, where you and I sit, I guess, right, between London and Paris. I don't think we've ever seen snow for more than like 10 minutes in the last, I don't know how many years. And then to see ice, you really have to go very high up the mountain, and only for very few months in a year you can actually see. So I think Russians have just assumed for some reason that the way winter looks at their place, which can be up to -60 for up to 6 months a year in some places, it's going to look like that everywhere else, and therefore this is going to be very scary, the cold, etc. And what I think was also very important on the European side was the media, like not in every country, but in many countries, media coverage of the war, and also the politicians' work of explaining to the public that lowering your temperatures or heating temperatures by 2 degrees isn't going to kill you, but we need to arm up, and we need to actually, this is also very too close to our borders to really ignore. And the public really digested this very well, and this was not obvious in the summer, and this today we know this is true. People do not consider lowering their heating or whatever. The discomfort is not enormous, and people do not consider this being a giant sacrifice. So, of course, the petrol prices, the energy prices hike did create social unrest in certain countries, certain moments, but it didn't result in another dissipation, in my opinion, of the Kremlin, that the social unrest, the social pressure in the public, it was going to be so high on the European politicians that they were going to have to cede. And this did not happen. Instead, even in countries like France, at the political debates in the National Assembly now, we can see that the parties which used to be financed directly by the Kremlin, extreme right, extreme left, even those parties which you have their party leaders, pictures with Putin personally in Russia, shaking hands and hugging, you have even those people today turn around and speak up for Ukraine, because it became so unsustainably toxic to support Russia in any way, shape, and form, even for them. So this is a real turnaround I think nobody could have predicted in the beginning of last year at all. And this was just to say about natural gas, to add one more thing about LNG, liquefied natural gas. And this is the gas shipped by boat. And for this type of natural gas, Russian exports have increased. Russia has had the strategic objectives to increase its role as a major supplier of LNG in the world back about a decade or dozen years ago, and that has transpired through its strategic energy objectives and energy policy documents. And by now it has been able to increase the volumes of exports, and those volumes have increased not only to Asia, which used to be the traditional from the very beginning of LNG production in Russia, target market. We are talking about South Korea here, Japan, China, but also to the European Union, including in this last year, the LNG exports from Russia to the EU have grown by 50%. So this is something to keep in mind as we're talking about sanctions and about the what's happening, because on the one hand, you have this tricky positioning, European Union, Russia was a game of chicken, who's going to do it first, who's going to, either the Europeans are going to wean themselves off first or the Russians are going to cut off the gas first. And then on the other hand, you have this still attempts by the industrial sector to adapt to the situation by prolonging whatever way they can still import the energy from Russia. And that includes LNG imports and explains why the LNG import from Russia went up in the same year as the pipeline imports went down. Luckily, I mean, for the economics dynamics, if the goal is to lower their revenues in this way, luckily, the volumes of LNG imports from Russia remain very low and uncomparable always to the pipeline imports. However, this is important to keep in mind if you want to kind of close the gap, so to say, close the gap on this gas issue. And then, of course, there is oil issue and oil embargo, which is considered together next to the SWIFT sanctions, if you just look on the surface of it, the most important sanctions on Russia, because of course Russian budget, Russian tax revenues and Russian exports are extraordinarily dependent on oil and gas together, right? To just remind, compose 70% of exports of Russia, oil and gas together, and about 50% of budget revenues, not of GDP, is different, but revenues. And in that couple, oil and gas, it's oil, which is really should play a predominant role. And oil embargo seems to be such an important, therefore, measure against Russia. However, when we analyze that, and that's another thing is important to understand for me, is just that on the one hand, you have the political will and political points shown by the European Union. What did we do in order to respond to Russia in the economic way? And this is a communication. But then behind it, we need to analyze how effective have the sanctions been? Have they really been as effective as they are talked about by the people who have implemented them? And there I would have not points of criticism for especially the scale of sanctions, the approach to sanctions, the whole logic behind sanctions. And the oil embargo is the most important I'd like to address here. And the oil embargo is important for the reason that, of course, given its role in the Russian economy, the assumption that is, in order to decrease the Russian economic capacity to fight the war, we are going to hurt Russia by hurting this very important economic sector, oil. And how are we going to hurt it? We're going to hurt it through oil embargo. And there we immediately stumble upon numerous obstacles immediately in the implementation process. So first of all, we stumble upon the obstacle of the setting of the objective overall, the strategic obstacle on the side of the people who impose sanctions. So the West, right? European Union and the West. And the first logical obstacle is that within that logic, which we just said, we want to hurt the Russian economy, but we do not want to hurt the Russian population. And there you have a huge dichotomy, a big logical problem, right? How can you hurt an economy without hurting a population? But that being said, and that's how it's phrased politically, and now we're going to get very more importantly to the real explanation. Therefore, the sanctions authors explain us, we are going to introduce the oil embargo, but not right away, first thing. So the oil embargo took about 10 months to get introduced, which allowed Russia perfectly to adjust and to prepare for it. And we're going to say how. Second, we're going to introduce the oil embargo, but we understand that not everybody's going to sign up to oil embargo, like China, India, they're free not to do it, and they are not going to do it. So we're going to also add a price cap. We're going to limit the prices at which Russia can sell its oil to the rest of the world and to whoever didn't sign up to the oil embargo. And the oil embargo will only concern also the oil by ship, and which is also important because you have oil by pipeline and oil by ship. And it's oil by ship, which would be embargoed, so to say. It accounts for 70% of all the Russian oil exports. It's not bad. But to say that still, it isn't all the oil that was embargoed, so to say. And then the price cap, therefore, would then limit the, would then tell to China, India, or other actors, look, if you don't want to accede to the oil embargo, you can at least buy the Russian oil at a price which was set, so we can hurt their budget. And then the most important, of course, questions that come up are, first of all, why did it take 10 months to impose the embargo? Second of all, why is the price cap set at $60 per barrel for the Urals, the Russian type of oil? Because $60 per barrel, if you look at the history of Russian budget, it's not too bad. It's not luxurious, but it's not too bad at all, by far.
So what are the extraction costs? I mean, to give myself and the audience an idea, what would be the combined extraction and logistic costs? And therefore, on $6 a barrel, what's the margin on that?
Excellent question. Excellent question. If you just talk about just the extraction cost, those are around $8 to $9. But the combined, and this is very important, logistics and extraction cost would be around $25. So we're still talking about an important margin. And the real reasons for that, beyond the communication that we're receiving, of course, I imagine that the European Union being very preoccupied about the well-being of the Russian population, or whatever that being the official reason, is especially preoccupied about the state of affairs in the world oil markets, because that's what affects the lives of its own population. And the way it affects the lives of its own population is by Russia supplying about 10% of the world oil.
I mean, it's still enough. I mean, it's to be ultra cynical, there's enough money in there for Putin to still skim off his 5%, the apparatchiks to skim off their 5%, and there's still enough left to go to the military-industrial complex.
Exactly. And the well-being of the people, it is not the sanctions nor the leaders of the European Union who are going to take care of that. Putin is taking care of that every day. Mobilization is one of the amazing measures to take care of the well-being of the Russian people. So it's just to say that that's not even an issue, the well-being of the Russian people. Let's be honest about it. But what's important, and what has been the major fault in the logic of sanctions, kind of fault and also a necessity, that if you exclude, the logic is, if we really impose a real embargo right away, well, how are we gonna substitute that oil? We as the countries of the European Union need time to transition from this supplier to other suppliers, since it just fell on us like the snow on the head in the middle of July. So we need to give ourselves time. So the embargo gives time to the buyer to transition and to find alternative sellers. This is number one. Hence we lost 10 months in terms of sanctions, because we won 10 months in terms of reorienting our own imports. And then, since we lost 10 months in terms of sanctions, what it means? It means that the Russians have prepared for it. So, as you mentioned, there are logistical aspects of export of oil by ship. You would export oil, you need ships. And 90% of those ships, were leased by the Russians from Western countries, especially from Greece. And 10 months of lag time gave Russia an opportunity to reorient itself, to prepare for the absence of those leases, and therefore to buy their own ships, or to increase the percentage of their own ships in the overall ships, or to lease it from some other people or whatever. So this is the reorientation. Second thing in the logistical supply chain would be insurance. Each oil delivery has to be insured. Nobody's going to buy it without insurance. And most of the insurance was provided, the vast majority, by several insurance companies, most of them based in the United Kingdom. And those, of course, would also then be jeopardized. And so Russia had all this time to renegotiate and try to negotiate with its buyers, especially reorienting also, just overall, most importantly, the supplies themselves from the European market, which used to be the most important, to Asian markets, China and India. Unlike in gas, in oil it was possible to do, because oil doesn't have to be always transported by pipeline. It's possible to transport also by ship, and most of the volumes, as we mentioned, from Russia are transported by ship, 70%. So the issues were, there were willing buyers, both China and India, who have received pretty much, who have seen their volumes coming from Russia, skyrocket, and those volumes are pretty much equal between China and India, but the percentage and the kind of the role of Russia in their energy supply is different. And then you had time to reorient the market. They had time to buy their own ships, or to find other leasing contracts. They had time to negotiate insurance contracts. This is the most difficult part, maybe, insurance contracts, because not everybody wants a Russian insurance contract, or no, maybe, but other possibilities are possible as well, and it opens up maybe some blue ocean on the world insurance market overall for oil shipments. Who knows? But just to say that all of that time gave time to Russia, and then finally we get to the price, and what do we see? Lo and behold, while in the beginning of the year the price of oil was skyrocketing above $100 per barrel, today it's below the $60 per barrel price cap. So not only it allows Russia to reap that margin you just mentioned, but also it allows Russia to still sell above market prices. And then the final argument, which is really something to really look into, we do not have data on this, and we're gonna mention it right away, the actual prices at which people like the buyers in China and India are buying Russian oil. Once the price cap was introduced at first, and this happened only on December 5th, 2022, right? So just keep that in mind. And even before it was introduced, but the rumors were already set and everybody knew already what the price was going to be. First of all, the market itself reacted to the unpopularity, to the kind of the anticipation of these sanctions, and to the toxicity of doing business with Russia. And market itself penalized the Urals. We saw these numbers in the spring, right away after the beginning of the war, of the invasion. The Urals was selling at about 30% discount vis-a-vis Texas, Western Texas Intermediate, for example, or vis-a-vis Brent. Now, that later it became more difficult to understand. Like, we saw these numbers in the spring, and then we didn't know anymore. So it's then considered to be $25, $30 discount vis-a-vis these other types of oil. And then you never know what are the actual prices that the buyers are negotiating one by one in contracts, because this is confidential information. So the logic was that once everybody, including the Indians and the Chinese, know that the market price, so to say, for the Russian oil is set at 60, nobody of them is going to be foolish enough to buy above. Why would they propose anything above? Even if they do not want to abide by the embargo, price cap, etc., why would they propose more? They would just rather propose less and use it as a bargaining power to bargain down the Russian. Okay, that has been put under question by some energy analysts, including Russian energy analysts, who are saying, well, contracts are more complicated than that. And it depends, the price would depend on the nature of the contract. Long-term contracts would therefore not necessarily abide by today's prices, tomorrow's prices. This is number one. And second, the prices that we see today are reflecting more what's happening today, but the negotiations had happened before, and the prices are going to be more, kind of spread across the amount of time. So the conclusion of that is that we don't really know if that logic of having a cap, which is a very logical thing, knowing about the cap, you try to negotiate your price lower if you are in India or China. But the logic of that is clear, but the reality of that is not clear. We don't really know how much, what volumes are bought at what prices in what contracts. And that is important to keep in mind as well. Now,
and of course, the reality, coming onto the whole ship-bound thing as well, there are also rumors, aren't there, that there are, transfers between tankers. There are all sorts of sanctions busting actions going on, extremely dangerous and quite sort of devious ways. The sanctions are being broken.
This question, actually, to do some self-advertisement, the Eastern Circles, our think tank, is going to do a whole conference on this issue on the 21st of February, just analyzing a year into the war, what are the defects with sanctions, especially SWIFT and on embargo. And this, what you're mentioning, is exactly what is a major problem, because of course, in addition to everything we just said, which are pretty much market dynamics, let's say, there are also 150 ways to avoid sanctions, which have been tested by the energy industry, traders, and everybody else, players in this field for years, during Iran sanctions, Venezuela sanctions, anything else. And of course, here you're talking about relocalization of ships. You have a Syrian ship, which can enter into Turkish Straits, which can cross any waters, which can transport whatever it was, transporting Russian oil, for example, or Russian oil being mixed with other types of oil in the middle of the ocean in international waters, or Russian ship relabeled, flags changed, etc. So or docking in the port of a friendly country, and there you don't even know what's going on anymore. So this is all of these measures are still in play, and this is a massive. We cannot even estimate how much oil is being sold and bought like this. And of course, these are important volumes. Yes.
And there were alternative arrangements proposition, weren't they? So I remember reading an article by the economist Anders Aslund earlier in the year, and rather than a price cap, I think his suggestion was to say, well, let them, sell it at the market rate, but the difference between the price cap and the market rate, you take that money and give it to Ukraine. You simply put that as a war dividend, and thank you very much. Make the Russian economy fund the Ukrainian war effort. Very clever idea. I don't know how practical that is in market economic terms.
Yeah, I would have to look at it more in detail to comment. I have to confess right away, I haven't heard Professor Aslan's suggestion, haven't read about it yet, so I'm not going to comment right now. But having had him as a professor at Georgetown, actually, I would definitely. I definitely respect his ideas. Just to say that. Basically, all of this is it illustrates how difficult it is, right? How complex it is, and how much time it took, and how imperfect all of this is. It illustrates to us how well integrated, in the end of the day, Russian economy is in the world economy, which makes it so complex and so difficult to exclude it. And on the other hand, it illustrates what we mentioned, I think, last time as well, is when Russia. The geopolitical consequences of this are going to be very important, aside from economics and from the immediate impact on the Russian economy. We have to keep in mind that whatever the hurt for the Russian economy, this is an important assumption that was made. The hurt to the Russian economy was going to transcend into the change or evolution in Russian decision-making on geopolitical front. And this is not necessarily true. It may transcend into Russian economy doing worse, a little bit worse, because the price is still favorable. Russian economy can do a lot worse and still survive. It went through 1998 economic crisis, 2008 economic crisis. It went through the fall of the Soviet Union. So people remember the very same people who live there now, much worse times. And economic hurt is not something that is going to move mountains, let's say, in Russia. Last time it created a revolution in 1917. We remember that it took people to go hungry, literally, and not to have any bread to buy in the shops in order to for long periods of time, in order to get to the boiling point. So to move Russian society, I'm not sure. Now, it's important, of course, to keep that pressure, but important also to understand that military action, of course, is much more important to move that, and that fighting a Kalashnikov with a euro banknote, it has its limits, right? I mean, that being said,
it's horrific to think, but when I was in Russia in the 90s, I remember someone telling me over a drink, when you have these conversations about what's going to prompt political change, what's going to prompt popular protest, and this guy just said, yeah, when the last sausage has gone and the last loaf of bread has gone, then something might change. Apart from that, he said, as long as there's sausage and bread, no one is going to give a damn about anything. And unfortunately, 30 years on, it's still true.
So sausage is like luxury. We have to remember also that we're talking about a country where 30% of the population has latrines outside. The toilets are outside for 30% of the population. So this is a level of. Then, that being said, of course, it's important to keep isolating Russia, and the facility of it kind of changing and shifting to China and India with the same speed that Germany was able to shift away from Russia really shows us how difficult it may turn out to be to really corner Russia economically. Hence, the strategic sectors become important. In Russia, there are only, we can sum up, right, as really very visible three high-tech exports. Used to be defense, so weapons. We thought they were high-tech. Then there is space, and that's also a Soviet legacy, right? Surfing on it and remembering that, of course, the launching station, for example, is not literally in Russia, it's in Kazakhstan. And then there is nuclear. And nuclear is an important part of this energy relationship with the West, including with the United States, actually. And here, just to remind ourselves, right, about some numbers here, that Russia produces about 14% of the world's uranium. It is also a dominating actor on the uranium enrichment and conversion market. And the uranium enrichment market, it owns 36% of it. The Russian subsidiary of Rosatom, Tenex, is the biggest player on this market, and it owns 17% of the nuclear fuel production market. So, very important actor. Even knowing that nuclear fuel, Russian nuclear fuel, of course, it's adaptable to Russian, let's say, style reactors mainly, right? And so, however, it does allow it to dominate, and that it's substitutable. We know it now as well, thanks to Westinghouse, but it is nevertheless important player on those. And this explains, in addition to this, what is more difficult to quantify, but is very easy to qualify, is also the dependence on numerous Western companies on partnerships with Rosatom for the sale of their own nuclear equipment. Hence, because Rosatom is number one developer of nuclear power plant construction in the world. So it's building the most nuclear power plants outside of its country than any other nuclear vendor. Okay, let's say China is building the most inside its country, and Russia is building the most outside. And hence, if you are, no matter where you are, you can be in France, you can be in, I don't know, South Korea, you can be anywhere. If you are producing in the Czech Republic, you can be in Hungary, you can be in other places. If you're producing something that can be used in a Russian or parts of Russian nuclear power plant integrated into other technology power plant, you are interested in partnering with Rosatom in order to sell your own equipment, because there are only as many power plants being built, and less and less of them in the European Union itself, for example. So if you're a European company,
none in Germany, for instance, of course.
Exactly. Germany is a great market dynamic. And it has a nuclear industry, which is not dead. The fact that German political decisions were made doesn't mean that all of the people are unemployed. They're still there, and this is much more difficult to quantify. But you can really point out to numerous partnerships of Western companies, from Rolls-Royce to Alstom to Skoda, with Rosatom. Some of them have Rosatom among the shareholders, and this is super complex. These relationships are super complex, and selling, let's say, a nuclear power plant command center is a difficult thing to sell. Even if you are very good at sales, you really need to know who's building nuclear power plants and who's willing to buy your command center in order to sell one. And hence, this creates a big underwater leverage, really underappreciated so far, because the industry is very closely knit, and it doesn't represent in the vendor market a lot of actors at all worldwide. So Rosatom being one of the few actors and one of the most successful ones in exporting its nuclear technology to other countries, it is a very important partner. In addition to dominating the uranium enrichment conversion markets, which means that it is the key provider of these two services, uranium enrichment, uranium conversion, on which countries depend, including the United States, including countries in Europe. They have used Russian enrichment and conversion services. And of course, substitution is possible. Recent history has shown to us, thanks to Westinghouse especially, substitution is very possible in such a complex and risky enterprise as nuclear fuel. You can substitute Western fuel for Russian fuel. Fantastic. It's been done in Ukraine. It's been done in Central European countries, working well. But to substitute that, it took about a couple of decades of industrial experimentation and non-stop work. Now, to substitute enrichment and conversion services, it's also possible. And of course, everybody has this expertise who is in nuclear. But here is the question of capacities. It's just the same as in the military-industrial complex. Everybody can produce weapons, but how many? And this is what we've been hurting ourselves against this right now within the military-industrial complex across Europe, especially, and even the US. But the same questions are here within the industrial complex on nuclear. How much the capacity has to be increased, and how quickly can it be increased without posing an issue for the nuclear industry? And this is one industry. When you're talking about natural gas supplies from Russia and the risk for the German industry, the risk is relocating. BOSS, for example, a big German chemical company, decided to relocate to China. It's parts of its production in Germany as a result of this difficulties and high prices for energy. But the stakes are big, they're high economically, but then security-wise, the stakes are, we don't know, right? But when you're talking about nuclear industry, anything that touches upon that industrial process, anything that involves any risks, any of losing anything, of having any gap in the industrial process, also translates immediately into physical security risks. And this is something the industry has very low tolerance for, which explains to us all of this, why the sanctions on the Russian nuclear sector have not been yet undertaken. That, in the face of flagrant Russian breaking of the international law, of all of the statutes of the international, of all of the pillars, of the 7 pillars of the statutes of the International Atomic Energy Agency, by its actions of the occupation first of Chernobyl nuclear site, and that of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which still remains under Russian occupation, despite of shelling of numerous of other 3 Ukrainian nuclear power plant sites, and despite of all of the absolute horrible treatment, including torture and kidnapping of the personnel of the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia. All of that leaves Rosatom so far unpunished, and maybe in the 10th package, which should be unveiled today, haven't seen yet the details. We're going to see some first maybe sanctions against Rosatom, but I do not expect them to go way too far and to touch upon all of these aspects we just mentioned, just for the simple reason that it takes maybe longer time. And hence we heard from the rumors of a 10th package, there were sanctions, maybe personal sanctions about this or that person in charge of management, sort of management. But this explains the real Russian leverage. It goes beyond the surface, beyond gas, and it stretches across all of the different sectors, all the way to domestic production of certain types of equipment in Europe.
And is it also the case that, the situation described here is both complex and takes a long time to turn it around? Also, the public perception or consciousness of this issue is nowhere. It's too complex to be covered in the mainstream media. It's barely known what level of expertise Russia has and its, claws into the global industry. Very few people are aware of that. We'll have heard of EDF and we'll have heard of other, China as big players of nuclear. Very few people will even have heard of Rosatom. So to an extent, politicians can kind of park it because there's not going to be a big public backlash against that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think that's why in the media also, it was important to bring forward and highlight what's happening in Zaporizhzhia. That was the only way pretty much to communicate about Rosatom at all in a simple, quote unquote, way. And what we've seen, the dynamic of this communication through the year is very curious, in my opinion. We've seen a lot of warmongering and nuclear threat, a lot of kind of media hype about nuclear threat from Russia, maybe even using the nuclear power plant as a triggering an accident there. We have quotes from Energoatom, Ukrainian operator of all nuclear power plants in Ukraine, which quoted a recording that they received or overheard to somebody by the employees, overheard and then leaked it to them, that in Energodar, in Zaporizhzhia, a Russian military commander, since it's an occupied site, there are hundreds of military personnel there, saying that to his troops, that all of the explosives have been installed in the reactors and they could explode them any time, which sounds absolutely insane. So all of these rumors and all of the mediatization of this has had its kind of up, maybe over spring and then a little bit over the summer. And then after the International Atomic Energy Agency traveled and when they reached Zaporizhzhia in September and issued this report, not that report got covered at all, absolutely blood-chilling report, by the way. But once they did it, for some reason, the media coverage stopped of the nuclear power plant, as if the threat has dissipated. And the important thing, and I do not understand why. I think the only explanation I have is the media cycle of about 6 months. Just people get tired of this in the media, they get tired of kind of turning it around. But the important thing to understand is that if we want to explain to the public very simply what Rosatom is a nuclear operator, which is now absolutely under the military directions and under geopolitical command, so to say, political command. So it's like having a central bank being ruled by your president and not by the chair of the central bank. It's very bad news, because just like the president, any president doesn't understand much about monetary policy. Well, for the most part, of course, don't want to offend anybody. If anybody understands, it's very good for them. But for the most part, any politician is very far from the nitty-gritty detail of understanding the monetary policy. Hence, the dependence on the central bank is important. The same way, if nuclear, industrial, and technology decisions are being taken by politicians for geopolitical purposes, we are really facing, it's a high risk. And Rosatom today cannot be considered as an independent actor. It hasn't been ever an independent actor, because it is just an arm of the Russian state. And on its board, on its supervisory board, management board, there are Russian state officials. This is all in their books, and this is normal. This is a strategic enterprise with very clear strategic and military objectives. But the fact that it's been used like this today, to me, heightens the risk of a military threat, including not just by thinking of always nuclear bomb, but nuclear bomb has a virtue of, if you can call it a virtue, that there is a response which is already pre-written in strategic documents. There is a nuclear doctrine that nuclear countries have, like the US or France, etc. And there is a certain response pre-written in those documents in response to a nuclear bomb attack. But there is no response written in any of the strategic nuclear documents to using of a nuclear power plant as a nuclear weapon. And this threat, in my opinion, just has grown in the recent months, especially since over 1,000 employees of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant now, a lot of them have been kind of fired or not allowed to go back to work, since they refused to accept Russian passports and follow the command of Rosatom. And hence you have a nuclear power plant where, in fact, you don't have personnel, and Russia is now recruiting personnel or trying to reposition personnel from Russian power plants to this power plant. And this is dangerous for several reasons. Well, first of all, because I don't think there is a line of people wanting to go to Zaporizhzhia at this point from Russia. And second, because even if you manage by force or else, it doesn't matter how, to get the people to go there, they do not understand, they do not really apprehend the operation of this particular power plant, because every power plant is different.
And, that's notwithstanding the military threats around the use of tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, which is rolled out every time there's an offensive due, or every time, Russia's backed into a corner and has lost territory, then the nuclear saber rattling begins again. Eventually, that use of military nuclear threat, that has to undermine the credibility of Russia as a civilian nuclear power as well. You cannot do one and be allowed to carry on doing the other.
Exactly, especially since in the mandate of Rosatom itself, it has both the responsibility for the implementation of the Russian nuclear doctrine and representing Russia in all the nuclear related international platforms like the IEA. It's Rosatom directly which represents Russia, the CEO of Rosatom. Also, in addition to its mandate of operating all of the civil nuclear power plants, in addition, it's responsible for all of the nuclear icebreakers, for example, in the Arctic Ocean, and for the Northern Maritime Route, which is has its own implications for the safety of trade and along that route, and also for the military security and militarization of the Arctic. So all of this is written in Rosatom's mandate and their responsibility, which is itself inscribed not in some internal company document, but in the Russian federal law of the founding of Rosatom in 2007. So indeed, this company is not just a company. They have really mastered this discourse that we are a company, our objectives are business objectives throughout the years. This discourse is corporate communication, but it does not reflect the reality. And today, I think everybody understands very well it doesn't reflect the reality. So yes, there is a big cognitive dissonance between the role of Rosatom, its role within the Russian political and foreign policy, even kind of apparatus, if you want, and its role and its the continued kind of attempts of Western partners of Rosatom and clients to hide behind a very thin fig leaf of calling it just a company and trying to draw the distinction which has never existed. So yeah, a very big cognitive dissonance there.
And the last sort of point there, of course, we know that the as part of sanctions, some delivery of high-tech components is brought the Russian aviation industry, the automotive industry to a standstill. Soon, people's individual cars potentially, will not get the high-tech substitute parts they need, so they're going to have to go for, more primitive vehicles. Does this same sanctions regime eventually affect the nuclear industry, where they can't get their hands on, high-tech components required for, say, the mission control systems that you mentioned earlier? And does that make nuclear accidents more likely in the longer term?
Yeah, this is a very complex question. Here we're talking about a very long supply chain, industrial supply chain. And it depends on which plant you're talking about, which project of construction of a nuclear plant you're talking about, how much of that project is sourced from Russia, how much of it is sourced from local suppliers, and how much of it is sourced from foreign parts. And every project, no matter what it is, even if the Russians are constructing it from start to finish, any client may ask that a component will come from somewhere else. And then it depends, right? If it's Turkey buying a part of a component from of a nuclear power plant for its own nuclear power plant in Turkey, well, it has to be constructed by Rosatom, but it's still a Turkish nuclear power plant. It's the whole question, right? Are people going to just stamp over their relationship with Turkey, or are they going to look for the ways around it? And then another important kind of question is whether another important aspect of any, let's say, independently from the geopolitical developments, how the contracts are actually structured of supplying Russian, for example, nuclear power plants in Russia with components from other countries, and how long-term these contracts are, how they are in general, what is behind them. And it may happen that there are already flaws, which are important flaws integrated there, which have already made the system function, let's say, not so well, which can be now further exploited. But also you can have the configurations where a supplier has Rosatom through other companies as part of its share, as one of its shareholders. And this then makes it very difficult to respond in a negative form to a supply of something. And of course, we are aware of the use of the very useful roles, quote unquote, useful roles by Turkey or Armenia or Azerbaijan or Qatar as the quote unquote laundromats for the imports of the sanctioned goods. And therefore, my short answer to this is that you can always find a way to go around sanctions for certain industries. Maybe it's not going to concern planes or cars, but for nuclear industry, if you need it, you may find ways. And another short answer is, well, but in theory, supply lines can be interrupted as well and should be interrupted, because of course the toxicity of Russia doesn't go away for anybody who's working, dealing with Rosatom. And a lot of the companies in the West, since the first days of the war, have frozen all of the meetings, all of the deals. We've heard got numerous deals, including deals in France itself, that have been frozen and not picked up since then. Nobody's touching them. So of course that must have repercussions. But to answer that question, we really need to know the exact contracts, of which there are a bazillion, and I do not own these details. So
that's fine. No, I think it's to get an overview is enough. And I know we're running out of time. We've only got a little bit of time left, but the last area I want to touch on is China-Russia cooperation. How far has this crisis deepened the cooperation between Russia and China? I think we've all been surprised that it hasn't extended into the military sphere. You know, we don't see Chinese ammunition. We don't see Chinese artillery pieces. Maybe some components and materials are getting through, but we don't see the cooperation that we perhaps expected. China, I think, realizes the toxicity of Russia and has a fear of secondary sanctions against its own industries. But in the energy sector, what does that cooperation look like?
Yes, well, just to kind of quick offside that on the military side, historically it's more Russia which exported military to China, and now that China knows that its military, most likely, especially after having looked at TV screens, most likely Chinese military maybe is more high-tech than Russian. There would be also, even in the normal times, let's say, I think there would be maybe a reluctance to export it, since the intellectual property laws in Russia do not differ very much from those in China. So they both know each other. But on the military front, therefore, I will just keep an eye on, however, on the increasing partnership between Russia and North Korea. And not to say that North Korea is not an actor and cannot sell its own weapons to Russia, but North Korea being a protectorate of China for many, many issues. This, to me, is something that is posing questions to me. But again, I'm not a military expert, so we're not going to go into this. Just to kind of quickly return to this. And then in terms of the energy cooperation, so Russia has been able to reroute a lot of its energy oil exports to China. 36% of its crude and condensate oil exports were going to China basically in 2022. Now this number must be much higher. So we need to see the numbers, the updated numbers at the end of the year, which are now being published by different sources, and we're going to see more of them in the coming weeks. And therefore this is for oil, which is much easier again to reroute, especially by ship. The same volumes we see also appearing in Russia-India trade. So when we are talking at the beginning of the year, we were thinking that Russia is going to be totally reliant on China, and thus will become, this just is energy appendix to China, so to say. And it is happening, yes, but Russia is also having these thoughts that it has to diversify and keep somehow diversifying its buyers in Asia, including big buyers, and hence India is there as a counterweight, we can say, in terms of diversification of energy supplies to China. Then in terms of volumes, India can consume comparative volumes so far of this, what we were seeing with oil. It does not apply to natural gas at all, because there is no direct pipeline between Russia and India, and there is one between Russia and China, and then there is another one, and then there are two oil pipelines between Russia and China. One is direct, ESPOL, and then one is China-Kazakhstan oil pipeline, which also transports some of Russian oil to China. So these connections help facilitate and increase Russia-China oil cooperation, but everything that you can export by ship can also be exported to India, and Russia has been doing that as well. So it kind of shows you the geopolitical considerations behind that. And in terms of natural gas, we said that the situation is completely different. So first of all, these are different fields, the gas production fields, which would source gas to Asia and versus to Europe, outside of liquefied natural gas, which are located closer to the Arctic Ocean or at the Arctic Ocean, and those are different. Then you can use both ways, whatever is possible. But in terms of the fields which are inland, Russia has reactivated Kovykta field, which is really in the very far east of Russia, and that is close to China, and it said that it was going to increase production there, connect to the Power of Siberia pipeline, expand the capacity, etc. And that we have said capacity would expand between what's maximum, but not necessarily all used today, 38 billion cubic meters, that's maximum, that's not all used, up to 48 by 2025 and up to 88 by 2050. So these are the goals which have been set for pipeline exports of gas to China. Russia has been also trying to negotiate for years now, for many, many years, a second gas export pipeline to China, Altai. Well, they had different names, but this is one of them. And that would be much more convenient for Russia, but extraordinarily not convenient for China for some reason. China is more reluctant, and hence this is something to watch for. Any project, we have to keep in mind, it remains only a project, only ink on paper. We have to look at something that where the construction has started. When the construction has started, we know it's real. When the construction has not started, it is not real. Overall, if you place it in the overall context, Russia had high expectations from its increasing cooperation in China in trade on many aspects, starting in 2014 when it first invaded the east of Ukraine, and also now again. And in my opinion, the expectations have been frustrated, both in 2014, when, for example, that's when Russia launched really the construction of Power of Siberia pipeline, and the expectations, if you remember, were that China was going to finance it. But China has absolutely had no intention to finance it, and Russia wound up financing it entirely on its own. And 2014 was not the best year for Gazprom. It had negative profits, in fact, that year. Net profit was negative in billions of in billions of rubles, not in billions of rubles, but still negative. And then for 2022, further, of course, even further frustration, let's say, because China understood that on the one hand, that this is an opportunity. So China is using this opportunity to negotiate favorable deals for oil and gas exports at low prices for itself long term, but also it's there is a limit, so to say. So the weapons deliveries we have never heard. China has been ambivalent about Ukraine invasion up until Russia has issued a few statements on a very high level about the possibility of using nuclear bomb, and then China immediately issued statements which showed that it did not at all favor the use of any weapon of mass destruction at all, especially since still Russia is a bordering country with China, since China itself is a nuclear power. And we have to look at what's Indian position on this, but lo and behold, we might see a big surprise that China and India, historic rivals, may actually be united upon their vision of the nuclear Armageddon. So this did not at all help China and Russia cooperation in more strategic terms, maybe, than Russia had hoped. Nevertheless, everything that's posturing, including military trainings, joint military exercises, including joint military exercises China, Russia, India, including these joint exchanges within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, continues. So the posturing continues, and the reality of it has to be carefully examined. Now, to return just to the energy announcements and energy reality, everything we said about sanctions, of course, China plays an important role, but also, more importantly for me, any kind of pivot to something else. And Russia hasn't pivoted to Asia just right now. It has been having this as part of its energy strategy, at least in Gazprom documents since 2010. And it has tried to launch this, what eventually ended up Power Siberia pipeline, back from 2006. So it's something that has been part of Russia's strategic thinking, which is also, from a commercial point of view, excellent, obviously excellent strategy, because China is a huge market and potentially growing. So back then they estimated it, and it estimates turned to be correct. Now, geopolitically, though, of course, it means the same thing as we've seen with Russia-Europe relations. We can now try to project toward Russia-China relations with totally different dynamics, because every infrastructure piece, be it a pipeline, be it a regasification plant, be it an oil pipeline, a gas pipeline, oil pipeline, be it a port to receive and to refine products, etc., petroleum products, you can place it into the time frame of 50, 100 years. So that kind of paves the way for that foreign policy relationship and the priorities in your foreign policy for the decades and decades and generations to come. Hence, if we have seen since the 70s and the 80s this tendency from the Soviet Union, given the Cold War, now this, to, however, develop a relationship with the European Union, with Europe back then, through these energy infrastructure connections. Now, today, we see the reversal of that and the tendency to develop that with Asia. What are going to be the consequences? For me, the consequence is already kind of in the cards, and watching it throughout the last year, deprioritization of gradual deprioritization of the European Union in the strategy, in foreign policy, and hence maybe more kind of positioning of it as a rival as well, hence a military rival. But in exchange, what Russia might have hoped was that the ambition by China, for example, to review the world order together and to come on top. Well, that hasn't really happened. The Chinese haven't shown that same amount of aventurism to go and to review it right away in such an abrupt form. And hence, the question is, for me, the risk is that Russia can find itself in the position of a junior partner, for which it is for China, no doubt. But China doesn't perceive Russia as an equal power, neither economically it isn't, nor militarily, nor anyhow either else. And also would give China, therefore, also what we are observing now, a lot of possibilities to increase its own influence in the region which Russia had considered to be its own. And that especially concerns Central Asia. Countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, more and more would come under China's not only economic, but also political and cultural influence.
I mean, if it was a rational player, economically speaking, and wasn't led by the military, priorities and indeed historical mythology, one could have said that Russia is ideally placed to be a bridge between China, Japan, the East, and Europe. If it was going to be rational economically, it could be an incredible economic power. But as you say, it just seems to pivot between, aligning itself with Europe. But that window is now closing. That window that Peter the Great opened almost 300 years ago, culturally and economically and militarily. That window, as some of my other speakers have pointed out, is slamming shut. And that cultural process, as you incredibly clearly defined here, is also followed by a economic and energy realignment, which is not just something that is happening in the weeks and months of 2012. It's something that's unleashed a process of decades-long transition. But perhaps this is not being done in any kind of strategic sense. There's no real strategic thinking behind this pivot.
No, I think actually strategic thinking here, I think it's one example for me, at least from the Danish perspective, definitely of strategic thinking. And just it's the same thing as with Europe. Maybe we're rather witnessing strategic miscalculation. And there was this hope of the over-reliance that the economic toys can then increase and common geopolitical positioning may lead to certain results. And I think Russia miscalculated here as on other fronts. It has miscalculated with the European Union on the softness of European reaction, and has miscalculated with China on maybe the level of caution that China is taking, at least so far, when it says the dynamic. And on top of it, China has been also having some problems with COVID and continuing internal COVID strategy, which have absolutely had repercussions on everything that it's doing outside, and also haven't been anticipated, I think, by anybody at all. And so for Russia, this is one more, maybe it expected to see some solid ground there, and instead, aside from some abstentions on UN resolutions or whatever, there is not much. And the reason is very simple, because just like Russia, China is fully integrated in the world economy and doesn't want to lose its place in the world economy and to start succumbing to the same future as Russia is designed for itself.
Well, Anastasiya, I know we're out of time, and there's so much detail to unpack. I'm definitely going to print out a transcript of this and go through your conversation, because there's so much there to learn and try to explore. And I'm incredibly grateful to you for giving so much of your time and sharing so much of your expertise in this sector, which isn't covered enough in the media. So incredibly grateful you're able to do this for the channel.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you.